It's a huge pleasure today to introduce a former colleague and dear friend whom I think most of you here already know, Dr. Bruce Berglund. He taught in the department here for about 15 years before going back to his home state of Minnesota. Hi, Dan. This is like a homecoming. That's great. I think a lot of you heard the online colloquium that Bruce gave us last March, a few weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think this is his first time speaking on campus since the pandemic.
Yeah.
Bruce came here to Calvin almost 2 decades ago with a PhD from the University of Kansas as a historian of Eastern Europe and Russia. And he very soon became our most popular teacher and expanded his range to include, among other topics, Western Europe, China, world history, and sports history. And he is now teaching one course on Russian history, a topic that suddenly got more interesting to a lot of people a year ago, at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. But he spent most of his time in the last few years as a writer on very diverse subjects and for very diverse audiences. He's published popular articles on world sports for the Washington Post and CNN, and he's often interviewed on world sports by American, European, Canadian, and Australian news outlets. His 2 most recent books for grown-ups illustrate the broad range of his interests. First, his 2017 book, Castle and Cathedral in Modern Prague, is a scholarly but very readable story about the intersection of architecture, faith, and politics in early 20th century Czechoslovakia. And in 2020, he published The Fastest Game in the World, Hockey and the Globalization of Sports, for a much more popular audience. And that is a page turner that made even my cousin, who doesn't read much history but plays hockey, and I gave him a book for a Christmas present. He said he was really surprised how much he enjoyed it. But it's Bruce's most recent foray into writing for children that I think has produced some of the most intriguing titles. And I just discovered a lot of these this morning after Bruce told me about them. So if you have any young people on your Christmas list, you should definitely go out and look up some of his graphic history books for young readers. I'm just going to give you my favorite titles of the 12, I believe, that he has either published or forthcoming so far. Night Witches at War, the Soviet women pilots of World War II. I actually have that one. Pogo Takes the Lead, heroic sled dog of the Alaskan Serum Run. Sergeant Reckless Braves the Battlefield, heroic Korean warhorse. Returning to the Moon, a Max Axiom super scientist adventure. I just ordered that one for someone who wanted a science book for Christmas. And Can You Survive the Battle of Ragnarok, an interactive mythological adventure. That's just a few. So go check them out. Bruce, it's great to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me back and setting this up. So the poster, which many of you saw, features this photo, and I'm going to start with that because that's such a terrific photo of sad boy Putin with his trophy. So this was from October 2015. The occasion was Putin's 63rd birthday. And just as I used to bring my kids and their friends to Craig's Cruisers and Sky Zone, Putin invited all of his friends to the hockey arena in Sochi, Russia, the site the year before of the Winter Olympics. And the friends who skated with Putin included oligarchs and government officials. Among the people who have skated with Putin are the person on the right is the current defense minister of Russia, Sergei Shoigu. And the person on the left is one of the leading players for the Soviet national teams in the 1980s who played in the NHL for the Detroit Red Wings, Slava Fetisov. Those of you who are Red Wings fans, I hate to break this to you, but Fetisov is a pretty slimy guy, so which will come out in the course of this talk. But Slava was a good line mate for Putin because he fed plenty of passes to the president. Putin scored 7 goals in the game for his birthday, leading his team to a 15-10 win. You can kind of get a sense here from this picture that the defense and the goaltending wasn't exactly in stopping Putin.
No Ukrainians on the team.
What's that?
No Ukrainian.
No Ukrainians on the team, exactly. So afterwards, Putin was awarded that big trophy that you saw in the picture earlier. The crowd chanted "Happy Birthday." The game was broadcast across Russia on live television. And this game for his birthday, this was not a one-off affair. Over the last decade, Putin has played regularly in exhibition games alongside former NHL players from Russia, as well as past members of the Soviet national team. Just last December, after his meetings with Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, meetings at which they discussed plans for moving Russian troops into Belarus for the planned invasion of Ukraine, the two dictators took to the ice afterwards. In this game, Putin scored 7 goals. Lukashenko only got 2. The pattern for this game and for all these games is the same. So former NHL stars like Fetisov, Pavel Bure, Ilya Kovalchuk feed Putin the puck and then get out of the way to let him score. And it usually ends up tallying 8 or 9 goals per game. Those of you who have seen video of Putin's hockey performances know that the president does not exactly put on a dazzling demonstration of skill. Putin learned to skate only 10 years ago. He has had his falls in games. And having been a middle-aged hockey player in a senior league myself, I will tell you, it hurts when you fall when you're old. It's hard to get up off the ice when you're old, and it's embarrassing. And you can see all of that on Putin's face. So hockey is not without its risks for Putin. So why does he do this? Why does he play in these games each year in front of large crowds on national television? Why does the Russian president risk embarrassment and injury to have former pro players feed him the puck and let him score easy goals? To offer some contrast, Justin Trudeau is a hockey fan and a seasoned skater, but he doesn't get on the ice with Canadian pros. Barack Obama was actually a decent basketball player, but he doesn't play or didn't play in televised games against NBA old-timers. So why does Putin take to the ice against some of the best players in the history of the sport, only to show that he's clearly out of his league? In answering this question, I'm going to look at how Putin has used sports for political ends in his 2 decades as Russian ruler. The most basic end for Putin's engagement with sports is to cast himself as the strong, vigorous leader for Russia. We can file his hockey exploits along with the photos of Putin fishing or riding horseback, often shirtless. We laugh, but this is not an insignificant goal. Okay, in terms of demonstrating his health, his vigor, his strength. When Putin came to the presidency in the year 2000, he followed Boris Yeltsin, who, along with his storied fondness for alcohol, was afflicted by various health problems throughout his presidency. And at this time, when Yeltsin was president in the 1990s, Russia was a sick state, not only politically and economically, but also in the health of its citizens, especially its men. In 1995, the average life expectancy of a Russian male reached its low point of 65 years. At the same time in the United States, it was over 75 years for men. So when Putin makes his hockey appearances, he regularly speaks about participation in sports and exercise as important for health. And indeed, a few of his annual hockey games have been in connection with the Night Hockey League, an amateur league for players from their teens through their 60s, which was launched by Putin in 2011 with the aim of encouraging exercise. Okay. Over 21,000 players across Russia participate in this Night Hockey League. For a point of comparison, the state in the United States with the most registered senior amateur players has 15,000 hockey players. Okay, so in Russia, we have 21,000 across the entire country, okay, amateur old-timer hockey players. Okay, the state with the most registered hockey players in the US has 15,000. Which state is that?
Minnesota.
No.
Wisconsin.
No. Years ago. California. Michigan has 13,000 registered adult players, amateur players. So the emphasis on sports in Putin's Russia has one laudable goal: improving the health and wellness of Russia's citizens. But sports in Russia have never just been about participation and physical activity. Russian sports are integrally connected with politics. During the last 2 decades, sports have been used not only to build the reputation of Putin as a great president, but also to rebuild the standing of Russia as a great nation, as a great world power. Okay? Recall that Putin came to the presidency after the trauma of the 1990s. The Soviet Union broke up at the beginning of the decade. The economy collapsed. Crime and corruption were rampant. Putin sought to restore Russia's standing in the world and Russians' pride in their country. Sports were a key part of that. Okay? And that's not unusual, right? To build national pride through sports. This is something that we with as well. But there's a key difference with Russian sports, particularly with Russia's involvement in international competition. Putin's use of sports follows from the Soviet model. That is, the political use of sports is deliberate and deceptive. As I discuss the ways Putin has used sports, I hope that you'll see my larger argument that the exclusion of Russian athletes today in the wake of the war in Ukraine is appropriate, and that world governing bodies in sports must be wary before allowing Russia back into international competition. So, how has Putin used sports? The first way has been by using international events, international sporting events, to reassert Russia's world standing, such as the FIFA World Cup in 2018. Throughout his 2 decades as Russia's leader, Putin has used international sporting events to project an image of the country as one of the world's leading states. He played a direct role in lobbying members of the International Olympic Committee for the 2014 Winter Olympics, and lobbying members of FIFA for the 2018 Men's World Cup. In fact, when Putin went to the IOC meeting in 2007 that decided on the location of the Winter Olympics, the 2014 Winter Olympics, Putin addressed the delegates in English. And this was a telling moment. Anybody here, has anybody heard Putin speak English? No. So this was a rare event, and it was a telling event, because Putin was approaching the IOC humbly, speaking their language, right? Something we don't associate with Putin much anymore. Russia's successful bids for these events were celebrated by Putin and others in Russia as proof of the country's return to the top rank of advanced nations, following the upheaval of the post-Soviet years. Putin said when FIFA awarded the World Cup to Russia, the decision shows that Russia is trusted. So using international events to build Russia's standing. Okay. Second, international events not only lifted Russia's standing, they also served to sports wash the country's aggressive foreign policies and growing authoritarianism at home. Okay. This term, sports washing, is a recent term used to describe the efforts of authoritarian governments to continue to maintain international goodwill while engaging in human rights abuses or conducting other nefarious activities. Putin has been a master sports washer. To give an example, in August 2008, Putin was at the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing for the opening ceremonies of the Summer Olympics. On that same day that Putin was in the crowd in Beijing, Russian troops were invading the neighboring country of Georgia under the pretext of a peacekeeping operation. As Putin correctly guessed, the attention of the world was fixed on Beijing. And indeed, the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics are still the most watched live event in sports history and TV history. 6 years later, Putin tried the strategy again. Only 4 days after the close of the Sochi Winter Games, Russian special forces seized Ukrainian government buildings in Crimea, the beginnings of Russia's annexation of that region. Putin and his cronies have been adept at using the presumably apolitical environment of world sports to shield themselves from criticism for these actions. When a reporter asked Alexander Zhukov, head of the Russian Olympic Committee, about the authoritarian turn of Putin's government before the Sochi Games, Zhukov replied, quote, "The games are supposed to be outside politics. Those who try to pin some political tails on them are just being undignified." International sports bodies have been willing accomplices to Putin's sports washing. Leaders of the IOC, FIFA, the International Ice Hockey Federation, and other organizations insist that their competitions are separate from politics. Athletes are not politicians, they insist. Therefore, athletes should not be held to account for the actions of politicians. In April 2015, former FIFA President Sepp Blatter met Putin in Sochi to discuss preparations for the upcoming World Cup. At the time, Russian troops were occupying the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Reporters asked Blatter about Russia's aggression. The FIFA president said, quote, "Some people are wanting the World Cup to be taken away from Russia, but we will give one answer to this. We are involved in football and will not allow politics to get in the way." By summer 2018, when the World Cup opened in Russia, an international investigation had found that the Russian military was responsible for the 2014 downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine, which caused the deaths of 298 people. 3 months before the tournament start, more than 20 countries expelled over 100 Russian diplomats after a former Russian spy was poisoned in Britain. Even the Trump administration expelled Russian diplomats in 2018. But none of that troubled the new FIFA president, Gianni Infantino. At a press conference in Moscow during the World Cup, he glossed over these incidents. "There are many injustices in the world," he said. Instead of calling out Putin, Infantino followed Putin's script. Quote, "This country, Russia, has changed. Everyone who has come to the World Cup has discovered a beautiful country, a welcoming country, full of people who are keen to show the world that what is sometimes said is not what happens here." End quote. That's sports washing. The third use of sports for Putin has been to project Russian power, to extend the country's political and economic influence into neighboring nations. The best example of this is the Continental Hockey League, founded in 2008. So the KHL is Russia's professional league modeled on North America's National Hockey League. The idea for the KHL came from the Russian veteran of the NHL on the left, Slava Fetisov. As the photo shows, Fetisov was part of Putin's circle. The president had named him Minister of Sport in 2002, and Fetisov was a member of the upper house of the Russian parliament, the Federation Council. Fetisov represented the far eastern maritime district in Russia, even though he was a lifelong resident of Moscow. So this was, really an appointed position. So Fetisov had pushed the idea of a league modeled on the NHL with the traditional European-style clubs turned into North American-style franchises. These new Russian franchises would be owned by wealthy businessmen or companies who would invest their money into buying top players. Fetisov believed that if you offered Russian players salaries that were competitive with the NHL, they would choose to stay in Russia rather than going to North America. This would be better for developing Russian players, so that Russia's national team would be more competitive in the Olympics. To get off the ground, the league needed financial backing. This had been the root of the Russian league's problems before, the lack of money to pay players, or even more basically, the lack of money to update and replace Soviet-era arenas. Okay? So the involvement of this person in the new league was key, Alexander Medvedev. Medvedev was a hockey fan. Okay? More importantly, he was the deputy chair and head of exports at Gazprom. He represented the large joint stock companies that had driven the economic growth in Russia in the early 2000s, the companies that Putin called Russia's national champions. He used this term national champions to describe Gazprom and other oil and gas companies. It would be these companies that would own the league's franchises and pay the salaries. According to the plan that Medvedev and Fetisov submitted to Putin, Gazprom and other major corporations would each make an initial investment of $10 million and then commit $5 million per year to the franchises that they owned. Okay. Putin approved the plan. Okay. In fact, Putin liked the plan so much that he later took credit for coming up with the whole idea. So when the new league was founded, Medvedev became the first president, and as promised, large Russian corporations ponied up the cash to build up a hockey league in Russia. Along with Gazprom, companies like the oil producer Rosneft, the pipeline company Transneft, and the mining company Evraz signed up as sponsors of teams. Putin said that this new league would benefit hockey as a global sport. It seemed to me, he said in an interview, that after the end of the confrontation, in the good sense of the word, between North American and Soviet hockey, something was lost. The sharpness disappeared. It seemed to me that if it was possible in the contemporary context to reestablish this struggle between European and North American hockey, it would be very interesting. It would breathe new life in the sport. So his argument was this is good for hockey as a game. More importantly, though, the KHL served to advance Putin's aims for Russia's foreign policy. The name of the new league, Continental, was key. Putin envisioned the KHL incorporating European clubs and ultimately entire European leagues. He posed this grand vision in positive terms. By expanding at the expense of Swedish, Slovak, Czech, and Swiss leagues, the KHL, the Continental League, would allow these nations' players to stay at home rather than going to North America. Putin said, quote, "We want all our clubs to be good in Russia, our own in Slovakia, our own in the Czech Republic, our own in Finland, our own in Sweden. This is the only way to raise the level of hockey." In other words, the KHL would check the power of the National Hockey League to draw players from Eurasia, just as a strong Russia would check the power of the United States in Eurasian affairs. The KHL succeeded in this. After the league's founding, the number of Russians in the NHL dropped by half. Okay, so they did stay in Russia. In terms of the global movement of hockey talent, Russia became a net winner in terms of drawing players to its league rather than a net loser. And the KHL was also successful in meeting Putin's geopolitical aims, at least at first. The league expanded to add teams in Prague, Bratislava, Slovakia, Zagreb, Croatia, Helsinki, Finland, and Beijing, China. Medvedev had plans for 60 teams in a league that would stretch from Milan and Berlin all the way to Tokyo and Seoul. Fetisov predicted that eventually all the best European and Russian players would be in the KHL, while the NHL would have only Americans and Canadians. The KHL met another one of Putin's aims for sports, and this is the fourth point. Sports help to create internal cohesion within the Russian Federation. Recall that when Putin first became president, one of the chief problems he faced was the internal weakness of the Russian state. Putin pledged to strengthen the Russian Federation and achieve national resurgence. A strong state and a unified nation were necessary to restore Russian greatness. This aim would lead Putin to enact a slate of administrative and constitutional changes that gave greater authority to the central government in Moscow over the various regional governments. So how did hockey fit into this plan? Well, think of the role that sports play here in promoting national identity and national cohesiveness. In Russia, the dynamic new hockey league served as a cultural institution to bind the far-flung Russian Federation together. Okay? And not just the Federation. Putin saw the KHL as a way of unifying the space of the former Soviet Union by having teams in former Soviet republics. So toward this end, the league established franchises in cities with little to no hockey tradition, like Khanty-Mansiysk in Western Siberia, or Khabarovsk on the Amur River out here in the Russian Far East. These are not hockey towns. Okay? A good example of this strategy is the team Vladivostok Admiral, founded in 2013. As with franchises in other non-hockey regions, this team was a cooperative effort of a major local enterprise, in this case, the commercial port of Vladivostok, the regional government, and the league itself. When the regional governor, Vladimir Miklushevsky, met with Putin in 2014, okay, they talked about issues such as economic development in the Russian Far East, infrastructure, education, and they also talked about the new hockey team. This is from the press release of their conversation. Miklushevsky, you know that we created the Admiral hockey team last year, and it is showing good results. Most importantly, the team is drawing people. We have the most crowded arena in the KHL, 99% capacity. You can't buy a ticket. We're even thinking of putting in additional stands. This makes me happy, says the governor, because of course the team is not an end to itself. The team is an example for many boys, girls even, because even girls in our country play hockey. Putin, all of this is correct. I definitely support it. Hockey is one of the most popular sports in our country. So their conversation played upon the main themes that Putin, Medvedev, Fetisov, and others stressed in promoting the KHL. Children were playing hockey, okay, so health and wellness for Russians. Second, the league is drawing fans, so there was a new excitement in the KHL and with the team in Vladivostok. And indeed, the KHL did offer a dynamic new form of entertainment that stirred community pride in cities that had franchises. So just as the league structure was adopted from North American pro leagues like the NHL, so were the trappings in the arena, like cartoon mascots and cheerleaders. And notice how the cheerleaders, though, are wearing the telnyashka, the striped T-shirt that Russian sailors and soldiers wear. So even old Soviet-era clubs like Red Army in Moscow now had cheerleaders and mascots and pregame introductions with light shows and clouds of dry ice fog. A number of KHL teams also built new arenas, and this was the case with Vladivostok, with Admiral. And the arena in Vladivostok was named in honor of the region's representative of the Federation Council, Slava Fetisov. Just as with new sports arenas in North America, these structures were seen as symbols of economic development and improvements in infrastructure. Business leaders and government officials, whether in Russia or in the United States, herald the building of a new arena and the arrival of a new sports franchise as evidence that the city has gained prestige. It has established itself on a national level. It has become major league. Here, so we see this in Vladivostok. Here, though, Governor Miklushevsky pushed the issue a bit too far in his conversation with Putin. The Vladivostok Admiral were not one of the best drawing teams in the league. Their arena was nowhere near 99% capacity. And when Miklushevsky visited with Putin, the team was drawing about 5,000 fans in a 7,000-seat arena. By comparison, the Griffins have an average crowd of just over 7,000 fans in their arena. So you get a sense here of the Russian tendency to overinflate success, right? This is a common theme in Russian history. But it connects to the main point. Sports are inextricably linked to politics, not simply to local goals of civic renewal and economic development, but to larger national goals. Think of why did the governor have to build up in conversation with Putin? Yeah, we're filling the arena, right? It wasn't just to say how great things are going in Vladivostok, but how great things are going in Russia. Journalist Slava Malamud, who was for years the North American correspondent for the Russian daily Sport Express, has said that, quote, sports and politics in Russia aren't only inseparable, they are synonymous. Sport is an organic part of Russia's body politic, and it is unimaginable without it, end of quote. Think of that. In the published summary, so this was part of the press release, the published summary of a meeting between the president and a regional governor, The conversation turns to hockey. Imagine Gretchen Whitmer sitting down for a meeting with Joe Biden and talking about attendance at Red Wings games, right? That this would be a political issue worthy of their attention. But in Russia, attendance at a hockey game is a matter to discuss with the president, because the president claims, remember, the president claims the hockey league was his idea, his project, as one part of his program of making Russia great again and reminding Russians of their country's greatness. So the KHL had a part in restoring Russian national pride. But even more important in this regard has been the success in terms of building national pride, has been the success of Russian athletes in international competitions. In summer 2000, when he had been president just for a few months, Putin addressed Russian athletes who were on their way to Athens for the Summer Olympics. Putin said, quote, "Victories in sport do more to cement the nation than 100 political slogans." I'll say that again. Victories in sport do more to cement the nation than 100 political slogans. So this view, expressed by a former officer of the KGB, followed the entire aim of the Soviet sports program. Russian athletes must win in international competitions to demonstrate the greatness of the Russian state and the Russian nation. We see this from the very beginning of the Soviet Union's participation in international sports after World War II. In November 1945, the Moscow soccer club Dynamo accepted an invitation to visit Britain. Before their departure, the team was called to the Kremlin, where they met Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, the head of the Soviets. The great leader of the Soviet state and the feared leader of the Soviet police gave a clear order to the soccer players: you must not lose. And they didn't. The visiting Soviet club drew against Chelsea and Rangers. They thrashed Cardiff City, and they took a close 4-3 win over Arsenal. Fortunately, the Soviet referee who had accompanied the team in order to provide fairness when they were playing in the UK, he disallowed a fourth Arsenal goal that would have tied the score. So this tour set the template for the post-war years. As the journalist Slava Malamud writes, quote, "Even Stalin's death didn't change the core philosophy. Sports existed entirely for the promotion of political gains. This was their entire purpose, always," end of quote. Now, so they couldn't lose, they had to win. How did the Soviets ensure that their athletes would win, other than sending crooked referees along? To be sure, Soviet coaches introduced innovations in strategy and training. So how many, just the students here, how many here have played sports? Okay. All right, keep your hands up. How many of you, keeping your hands up, participated in your sport, so practicing, having games outside of the normal season of that sport? So like played hockey in summer or baseball in winter. Keep your hands up if that was the case with you. Okay. How many in your sport engaged in training that didn't involve the sport itself, say cardio training or skills training? Okay, I see nods. All of that, you can put your hands down, thank you. All of that comes from the Soviets. All of that was invented by the Soviets. The Soviets invented year-round training for your sport outside of the season. The Soviets invented what we would call dry land training, okay, away from the hockey rink or outside the pool. Okay, so these were Soviet inventions. Athletes prepared year-round. So to give an example, the Soviet hockey team would train 11 months a year. They had 1 month off. Okay? The rest of the year was dedicated to practicing, playing, cardio training, strength training, all preparing for hockey. Was it successful, this method? Yeah, here are the international tournaments that the Soviets won from the 60s in hockey, from the 60s through the end of the 1980s. They dominated international hockey. Okay? But this level of success, this level of domination does not come only from advances in training and strategy, right? There must have been another secret to how the Soviets won, and the Soviets they were this successful because they cheated. During the 1960s, both from the 60s really in through the 80s, both the Olympics and the Hockey World Championships were still limited to amateurs. Okay, so these were, according to the rules, a hockey player or any athlete in the Olympics could not make their primary livelihood from sports. They had to have another job. Okay, so when the season was over, they were supposed to go back to their regular job. Before the Olympics, all athletes had to fill out a registration form in which they stated their job. Okay, I've seen these registration forms in the Olympic archive in Switzerland. I've seen the Soviets, what the Soviets put down. Okay, the Soviets followed this rule on paper. I've seen the paper, but in fact, the Soviet athletes were not amateurs. Soviet clubs were called clubs. So to give an example, Dynamo, the logo on the left, Dynamo was the club associated with the state police. The team on the right is what we know as Red Army, which was associated with the military. So on their registrations, athletes from these clubs, if they were participating for a national team or in the Olympics, they would list their occupation as police officer or soldier. Okay? In fact, however, their year-round job was training for and competing in sports. Okay? So on the face of it, these were amateur clubs. Okay? Athletes competing for these clubs were eligible for the Olympics, unlike the openly professional athletes in North America. But in reality, Soviet athletes were professionals. In the 1960s, Soviet hockey players earned about 2 to 3 times more than the average Soviet worker. And when they won an international tournament, each player received a bonus that was roughly equivalent to an average Soviet worker's salary. Sports officials in other countries recognized this ruse and they complained about it. They would send complaints to the International Olympic Committee. The International Olympic Committee would forward the complaints to Moscow. Moscow would respond, our athletes are amateurs, okay? Even though they knew this was a deception. So Putin's Russia can no longer use this deception, right? Okay, since the 1990s, professionals have been allowed to compete in the Olympics. So in order to maintain their unfair advantage, sports officials in Putin's Russia adopted another Soviet-era scheme, doping. A 2016 independent investigation not only confirmed widespread doping in more than 24 sports programs in Russia, it also showed the involvement of the Russian Ministry of Sport and the Federal Security Service, the FSB, the successor to the KGB. So far, there is no evidence, direct evidence, linking the doping program to the president. But think of this. If Putin took a direct role in starting a hockey league, do you think they were doping Olympic athletes without his knowledge and approval, right? In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a lot of coverage and debate about the exclusion of Russian athletes from competition. But keep this in mind, Russian athletes were already banned from many major international events due to the doping investigation. At the Winter Olympics that concluded just before the invasion, there was no Russian national team. Instead, Russian athletes competed as representatives of the Russian Olympic Committee. They had to compete under the Olympic flag. They had to, if they won the gold medal, it would be the Olympic anthem rather than the Russian anthem that would play. Despite these sanctions, recall that the games were clouded by a doping scandal involving a Russian athlete, the figure skater Kamila Valieva. The sanctions in response to the doping investigation tried to create the illusion that Russian athletes weren't really representing Russia, right? We're going to allow them as individual athletes to go to the Olympics. They're not representing their country. When I was at the Winter Olympics in Korea in 2018, again, where Russian athletes weren't supposed to represent Russia, all the fans knew their athletes were representing Russia. Okay? There were plenty of fans waving Russian flags. I love this guy. So he's got a Putin hockey jersey on. Okay? So the fans knew that their athletes were representing Russia. There were plenty of Russian flags. There were even Soviet flags. I remember I was walking through the arena at the Olympics, and I caught on my eye a guy, it wasn't this guy, it was somebody else wearing a Stalin t-shirt. And I was just kind of like, wait a minute, Stalin at the Olympics. So there was no sense of that Russian fans, as well as Russian athletes, were following along with this illusion that Russian athletes were not representing Russia. Okay? Now, this past winter, when victorious Russian athletes returned home from the Beijing Winter Olympics, They served as props in Putin's giant rally held in the main football stadium in Moscow on March 18th. Wearing their medals, they were representatives of Russian greatness, standing behind the president who had built this great Russia, who had launched a war to extend this great Russia. For Putin, in his use of Russian sports, it is all about winning and what winning communicates. To give an illustration of this, look at, walk over here, there's a guy back here, you can see his leg, he's hiding back there. Okay, let's zoom in on that guy. Okay, you see him there in the background? Okay. This is Ivan Kulyak. Ivan Kulyak is a gymnast. You might have seen this picture from back in March. At an international competition in Abu Dhabi in March, Kulyak, when he went on the podium to receive his bronze medal, wore the Z. Okay, so he's got the Z, the insignia of the Russian invasion on his uniform. He has since been banned by the International Gymnastics Federation from international competition. Okay? So let's go back to the picture of him in Moscow. Okay? So Kulyak was on the stage. So the rally took place after this meet. Kulyak is not wearing his bronze medal that he won at the gymnastics meet. He's wearing a gold medal from the 2016 Rio Olympics. The twist is, Kulyak didn't win a gold medal at the Rio Olympics. He wasn't even at the Rio Olympics. But to merit a place on the podium, standing behind the president, doing his part to cement the nation, Kulyak had to be a winning athlete. It didn't matter if he had cheated to win, whether by doping or some other scheme. It didn't matter if he hadn't won at all. It mattered that he looked like a winner, that he had a medal around his neck, even if it was someone else's medal. To finish, I will bring us back to the beginning of Russia's involvement in international sports. In 1950, the Soviet Union submitted an application to join the International Olympic Committee. This was the necessary first step to the Soviets participating in the Olympic Games. Some members of the IOC were under no illusions that Soviet athletes met the requirements of amateurism. From all reports, the best Russian athletes are state protégés with all sorts of special concessions and rewards, said one report. Other IOC members, however, were willing to look the other way in terms of amateurism. They wanted the Olympic movement to be truly global, including the Soviet Union and the communist states. Others recognized that the IOC was backed into a corner. If the IOC turned down the Soviets' application, Moscow would denounce the decision as a violation of the IOC's own principle of keeping politics out of sports. And then there were other IOC members who insisted that participation in the Olympics would have a positive effect on the Soviets. The young people of the Soviet Union, they argued, would learn to follow the rules, regulations, and norms of international sport. Through participation in the Olympics, the Soviet Union would become a more trusted, more accountable, more reliable member of the community of nations. 72 years later, we can say that this noble mission has failed. Sports and political authorities in the Soviet Union worked assiduously to circumvent the rules, regulations, and norms of international sport in order to ensure Soviet victories. Authorities in post-Soviet Russia, with Vladimir Putin at their head, have done the same. For this reason, the banning of Russian athletes from international competition in response to Putin's war in Ukraine is justified. Putin has used Russian athletes to strengthen his political position domestically and internationally. By excluding Russia from world sport, it removes this tool that Putin has used expertly. But the problem with Russian sports goes beyond Putin. When this war ends, it will likely bring Russia's defeat, hopefully, and Putin's fall. The governing bodies of world sports should not take that opportunity to welcome Russia back, to welcome fans like this back, in a gesture, an apolitical gesture of healing and reconciliation. Instead, the IOC, FIFA, and other governing bodies must acknowledge that the Russian state has never played fair throughout its involvement in international sports. If Russia is going to come back to world sports, it has to commit itself truly to the norms of international competition, to recognize that a victory gained by dishonest means is not a victory.
Other countries have faced censure or sanctions from the IOC, or maybe from FIFA too.
In history,
Yeah.
South Africa is a notable example that during apartheid it was sanctioned by the IOC, and South Africa was excluded almost entirely from international competition during the apartheid years. Yeah.
Have others been, I was imagining Dan's question, maybe it wasn't, but I was wondering, have others been sanctioned though for similar cheating, drug?
Oh,
use, that kind of
so for doping, not to the extent of what you see in Russia. What happens most often, so this has happened with a couple African countries recently, is government interference in how, so sports federations are supposed to be independent of government influence. So there have been a couple countries, I think Zimbabwe was one, that have been sanctioned by FIFA for having government involvement in how sports are governed in the country. Perhaps, I don't know if Dan, if you were thinking of this, but Belarus has also been excluded from international competition in the wake of the attack on Ukraine because of its alliance with Russia. Yeah.
And did East Germany face sanctions? Because I remember this.
So that was an interest. So you did have in the early part of the Cold War. Well, you have the example going back to World War I. In the wake of World War I, Germany, Austria were excluded from international competition. In the wake of World War II, Germany and Japan were excluded from international competition. And then in the early part of the Cold War, you did have East Germany being excluded. There have been questions in terms of the status of Taiwan over the years. So it's not been, you have variations from kind of Olympic cycle to Olympic cycle in terms of figuring out these political issues of who should be allowed to participate, and who should be excluded. Yeah.
But what kind of impacts did Berglund and Ice have in Russia as far as their goals of winning and having success? And
they were so I always think of when Americans ask a veteran of the Soviet team, what about the miracle on ice? That would be the equivalent of somebody asking LeBron, what year was it in which Olympics where the US Olympic team lost with LeBron? It was early in his career, so for the Soviets, they won everything. And they're always asked about this. Asked about this one game, right? And so for them, it's something of a blip. It's an annoying blip in their record of excellence, right? But it keeps coming up. And what is interesting, so a few years ago, there were a couple documentaries that were done from the Soviet perspective. One featured Fetisov, where he just gets to basically blab his heart out. And it was somewhat, it was a slanted view, because what doesn't come out, what former Soviet players say in Russian papers is they thought the Americans were doping. Yeah. They say there's no way the Americans could have kept up with us because we were the best hockey players in the world. They must have been doping. So,
yeah. I'm curious about a slightly different way of approaching the topic, where it worked in a sense. And what I'm thinking of is the way the world, not just Russians, fell in love with Olga Korbet, or
yes,
Romania's Nadia Comaneci a few years
Yeah.
later, or the love that Canadians developed for their nemesis, Vladislav Tretiak, and he for Canadians.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that despite the political machinations, something of the idea seems to work at the level of individual.
Yes, you're exactly right. And we saw this in the wake of the start of the war in Ukraine, right? And I was tracking Twitter, hockey Twitter, right? And so as talk came up of excluding Russian players from the NHL back in the spring, you'd get hockey fans in the United States and Canada, who's, oh, we can't do that. We can't violate the dreams of these players. I mean, that would be awful. How dare we do that? And there were some players or some former players. So one example is Dominik Hasek, the Czech player. Hasek said, no, I mean, it's a war. It's a war. You got to send these guys home. The league has to suspend their contracts. And so there were still, as the war was going on, you would see at NHL arenas, people wearing Russian national team jerseys with Ovechkin's name on the back, right? So, it's pretty remarkable how fandom will blind people to, which is seemingly a clear-cut, more, it seems pretty clear on which moral side you should stand on when you have an invasion of you and you have atrocities and all kinds of things going on. But no, he's on my team, so he's my guy. Yeah.
Are these young patriotic Russian athletes like the cute blonde kid with a Z on his shirt? I forget his name, but I remember the picture.
Yeah.
Are they more brainwashed than other young Russians? I mean, is it part of the training that they go through as professional state-funded athletes that they're even more?
So they understand what, and this is something that this journalist I mentioned, Malamud, stresses, is that there's an understanding when you come through the Russian sports system that you're a representative of the nation, right? And your task is to, you're not winning for yourself. You're winning for Russia, which is why you see these athletes going on stage with Putin. You see, for example, the most notorious example is Alexander Ovechkin, who's the most famous Russian NHL player, who still to this day on his social media sites has pictures of him and Putin. And and Russian athletes will say, well, I'm afraid for my family, or I'm just an athlete, so I'm not involved in politics. But you saw in the wake of the war, the several members of the Russian Chess Federation, so the top chess players, came out and condemned the war. So chess players are brave enough to condemn the war. But big hockey players are fearful of what's going to happen to them if they go against the war. And I should say that something that we miss as Americans, we stress sports is about individual dream fulfillment, right? I want to compete at a top level in sports to fulfill myself as an individual. We don't have the sense of athletes being representatives of their community or of their group or of their nation. The chairman of the Russian Duma's Committee on Sports talked about Russian players in the NHL, and he said, all of Russia takes pride in these guys. Okay? So there is, on the Russian side, there's this clear sense of, these are our people. They're representing our nation. We take pride in them. Whereas on our side, we see it as, we can't allow individual Russian athletes to give up their dream to play in the NHL, even if there's a war going on. You got it.
Yeah. To continue kind of the theme of blinding fandom, are Russian fans kept unaware of these doping scandals and government sponsorship of athletes, or do they know about it and simply not care for the sake of winning? Like, where are the fans in terms of that knowledge?
They don't care. Wins are wins. Yeah. So wins are wins, no matter how they're gained. Yeah. So. And we do, we shouldn't say Russians are terrible, because there are a lot of fans of American teams who tolerate the misdeeds of somebody on their team as long, but he's a slimy guy, but he's our guy. So yeah. But there's no sense of, these wins are tainted because because they were, the doping investigation and the sanctions are commonly viewed in Russia as an American conspiracy. Somebody else have any? Yeah.
So do you think it's a similar kind of thing with like the World Cup in Qatar 2022, and then with also like Newcastle owned by the Saudi investment fund, Man City?
That's sports washing, right? Is to build international prestige by getting involved in sport, and it works. It works really well. And I mean, it would have worked for Putin if he hadn't gotten too big and invaded Ukraine. I mean, he would have lived out his life and would have been regarded as, yeah, an authoritarian, but hey, he hosted the World Cup, so he's a good guy. Yeah. Somebody have a hand up over here in front of us. Yeah.
Back in the 70s, I remember that argument about professionalism going something like this from the American point of view, that it was hypocritical for full scholarship American university athletes who complain about Russian professionalism. Where did you stand in that kind of history? Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh, good grief. So back to the question about the 1980 Olympic hockey team.
Right.
Those guys were genuine amateurs, right? Where for their time that they were on the team, they just got enough for beer money, basically. Whereas a Soviet hockey player, like I said, so Soviet hockey players relative to NHL players, they were paid about the same. An NHL player made about twice as much as an average worker in Canada or the United States in the 1960s. So Soviets were kind of paid at an equal rate. They would get these big bonuses, like I said, and Soviet athletes, Soviet hockey players, they get to compete abroad. And when they did, they would buy Western goods, bring them back and sell them on the black market. And they would make even more than their bonus. Okay. So Soviet hockey players were doing quite well compared to, the one scholarship athlete I know personally, my sister-in-law, she played softball in the 80s. She'd have to go give blood every week to have enough money for hamburgers. Scholarship athletes just were not living high on the hog back in the 70s. So no, there's no comparison. But to the IOC saw scholarships they saw this as a betrayal of amateurism. So they were utterly blind to what was happening. They were willfully blind to what was happening in the Soviet Union, and they would pick any hint of a North American athlete getting too much and say, "Oh, you're violating amateurism." Yeah. But
Professionals in sports like skiing get away.
so they're the ones who break the system.
Oh, okay.
Skiers are the ones who break amateurism. Because, and skiing is a great example. I mean, you need to train a lot, right?
Yeah.
To ski. And so they would, the skiing federation would say to the IOC, okay, you're being completely unrealistic. Okay. If we want top level competition, our skiers have to dedicate all their time to training. They can't have jobs and then ski on the side. Okay. It's just too dangerous. And if they're going to do this, they need to be paid for skiing. Okay. And the payment would come for skiers in the form of sponsorships. Right. And so it starts breaking down. It begins to break down in the 60s. In 1968 at the Olympics in Chernobyl, the Winter Olympics, skiers start when they're on the medal stand, they have their skis that are branded. You couldn't do that before. That was a violation of rules. And the IOC said, wait a minute, you can't do this. And the skiing federation says, tough. We need to pay our skiers because they need to practice. You want top level competition. We need to pay athletes to compete at the top level. Yeah.
So Los Angeles is hosting the Olympics in 2028, I believe, which I'm very excited about because that's where I'm from. But I'm just wondering, and you said that Americans' view of sports and treatment of it as an individual, fulfillment of a dream is very different than other countries in which representative of a nation. So do you see or predict sports washing playing a role in the United States hosting the Olympics, or would that change in our political setting? Like how would that fit in?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, because it's a different dynamic, and we've seen it already with bidding on the Olympics, not only in the United States, but in other countries, where you see an emerging movement in West European and North American democracies, where communities, rather than accepting the games as kind of sports washing, bad policy, or things going wrong, you have grassroots campaigns to not host the games because communities recognize this costs a lot of money. It diverts money from things the community needs. So you have that. You have this real activism that has led to cities withdrawing their bids for the games. I think Vancouver most recently withdrew its bid for the games because of civic pressure. You do see, as I'm saying that, you do see elements of sports washing in Western countries hosting the games, particularly in how communities are moved around to develop infrastructure and so forth. So you've seen that, but you've seen this in Brazil, but you've also seen it it happened in Vancouver prior to the 2010 games. And so there is, for that kind of event, communities and people are going to get pushed around, and organizers of the games say, but yes, the benefits of hosting the games outweigh the fact that we have to move this community out of the way to build an arena, or that we have to go over the promised budget in order to bring about the games. So that's what you see mostly in the West. That's really a good push. Yeah,
A kind of different dynamic. Kind of the inverse of sports washing is people taking advantage of the arrival of the Olympics or another very big global event to stage protest. And I'm thinking of the Mexico City Olympics of '68.
That doesn't happen anymore, right? The IOC, when I went to the games in South Korea, and it's not only in the Olympics now, right? It's all sporting events, right? To make sure there's high levels of security to keep out any protesters. And this has added to the cost of hosting the Olympics, is that you're expected to have security, not only to prevent against terrorism, but also to prevent against unsightly demonstrations. Yeah, so that's a good point. You're not going to see something like 1968.
So after Russia got caught basically for doping, then you have to assume that it continued in some form. But what protections or things have the Olympic Committee or FIFA put in place?
So that's the thing with the World Anti-Doping Agency, is they're always kind of playing catch up. The dopers have the head start in terms of developing new ways to dope and new ways to conceal the doping. And then the anti-doping authorities have to figure out how do we catch them. In the Russian case, if you haven't followed this, I mean, it was the most egregious. Not only were they kind of tinkering with new forms of chemistry, but handling urine samples through holes in walls and stuff. It's just like so Soviet. And they got caught, right? So back to the question, I think it was the question you asked about doping. So the person, and I can't remember his name, I think it's Radchenko, the doctor who had been responsible for the Russian doping program, who then became the whistleblower. I mean, he is persona non grata in Russia, right? He's seen as somebody who betrayed the nation rather than a noble whistleblower. Now, yeah.
What's the status of the Continental Hockey League now?
The Continental Hockey League is, so the teams in Europe folded largely because they did not have Russian oligarchs bankrolling them. So they ran out of money. The most recent was in Finland. But also with the war, a number of federations in Europe. So for instance, the Finnish Federation, the Swedish Federation, the Czech Federation said, if any of our players play in the KHL, you aren't going to play for the national team.
So what's left of the KHL is just Russian now.
So it's Russia. There's team in Belarus. So the teams in Finland, the teams in Latvia have all left the league. The team in Beijing is still in the league. But the fate of the KHL rises and falls with oil and gas prices, right? So when oil prices were high, the KHL was flush. They could bring in players. They could expand the league. Now the Russian economy is in poor straits, and players go unpaid, and arenas are in disrepair and so forth. Yeah. So. All right. Thank you
All right,
all.
Bruce, thank you so much.